Evelyn Zumaya reads AffairsValentino.
I am Evelyn Zumaya, the author of AffairsValentino, and I want to read my book to you. From page 110, chapter 6, titled The Third Degree. May 1922, 8 years before George Ullman's day in court. The city of Palm Springs is located in the Coachella Valley, about 100 miles southeast of Los Angeles. Back in 1922, movie stars in search of some peace and quiet found Palm Springs' mountain vistas and 350 sunny days a year comfortably far from the limelight. But on Monday, May 15th, this cherished seclusion was being violated in the lobby of the Desert Inn, and some bad news was traveling fast. Los Angeles detective Sergeant Jess Wynn stood at the Desert Inn's front desk grinding his cigarette into a heavy glass ashtray, listening intently to the voice on the phone. Sergeant Wynn and his partner, Sergeant King, had been waiting for over an hour in the desert heat for their call to go through to the L.A. County District Attorney Thomas Woolwine. By the time Sergeant Wynn got his word in edgewise, there were beads of sweat on his forehead. "That's right, Mr. Woolwine. We've got 5 witnesses saying Valentino spent his wedding night here in Palm Springs." With a guttural yup, Sergeant Wynn set the heavy receiver back on the phone cradle and turned to his partner, saying, "Looks like we nailed him. Valentino is going down." Sergeant King mopped his forehead with a handkerchief and stuffed it back into his suit coat pocket. "A smoke screen," he said. "Between you and me, that's all it is. As soon as this Valentino story breaks, nobody will be reading squat about D.A. Woolwine's problems." The 2 gumshoes had just tailed the Valentino wedding party all the way from Mexicali, Mexico, and were ready to call it a day. They'd hoped to file their report with the district attorney and then head out of Palm Springs. But the cooler air of Los Angeles would have to wait, as the DA had just ordered them to skulk about for a little more dirt on the movie star's wedding night. Unaware they were being followed by detectives, Rudy and Natasha were settling into what they thought would be their blissful honeymoon. Rudy's long-awaited divorce from Jean Acker was finally granted in January, and the decree was filed with the court on March 4th. Despite Rudy and Natasha's rush to marry, they waited until May for a break in their workloads and a few uninterrupted weeks for a honeymoon. Their marriage plans were complicated by one not-so-minor snag. Rudy was only granted an interlocutory decree of divorce from Jean Acker. Under California law, an interlocutory decree required both parties in a divorce to remain unmarried for a period of 1 year before the divorce was considered final. But in Hollywood in 1922, there was a generous and well-known loophole in this unpopular statute. The frustrating year's wait was routinely circumvented by a quick drive south to Mexico, where couples exchanged their I-do's before a Mexican judge. Since California law had no jurisdiction in a foreign country, authorities were powerless to prevent this practice. Before leaving for their marriage in Mexicali, Rudy and Natasha informed attorney W.I. Gilbert of their impending south-of-the-border marriage. Despite Gilbert's opposition, Rudy set the necessary paperwork in motion. On Friday night, May 12th, a small wedding party, including Rudy, Natasha, and their friends Paul Ivanov, Alla Nazimova, and actor Doug Gerard, left Palm Springs for the drive to Mexicali, Mexico. They spent the night in El Centro, California. No one in the wedding party noticed that a car had been following them all the way from Palm Springs, or that 2 men lurked in the lobby of El Centro's Golden Hotel. The following morning, the Valentino wedding party arrived at the home of Mexicali's mayor, and news of the movie star's arrival threw the citizens of Mexicali into a flurry of preparation. Women bustled about a long table in the mayor's yard and tended to a spread of tamales, enchiladas, and stacks of steaming tortillas. While the mayor perused the marriage license and positioned the wedding party for the ceremony, a mariachi band struck up a rendition of La Paloma on the veranda. Since May 13th also happened to be Paul Ivanow's birthday, there was much to celebrate. As the sounds and aromas of a true fiesta filled the air, a dozen onlookers crowded into the mayor's office. With Doug Gerard, Jerry, acting as best man, Rudy and Natasha exchanged their wedding vows and were at last pronounced husband and wife. The groom gave his bride a kiss, a few champagne toasts were tipped, and Mexicali erupted in celebration. Early that evening, the newlyweds thanked their hosts, waved to the cheering crowd, and began their drive north back to Palm Springs. Despite all of Rudy's meticulous attention to the details of his wedding, he'd overlooked one critical detail. In order to have completely circumvented California's law of interlocutory divorce, at some point before leaving Mexico, he should have pulled the car over and consummated his marriage. Unfortunately, he was unaware just how important the exact location of this consummation would prove to be. By marrying Natasha in Mexico and neglecting to spend at least one night with her there before crossing the U.S. border, he risked having his actions interpreted as a willful intent to circumvent California law. But Rudy and Natasha were in such a celebratory mood they headed straight back to Palm Springs. They were completely oblivious that two detectives continued to track their every move and skulk just out of view, hoping to pinpoint the exact location of their wedding night. The Valentinos' marriage was consummated in Palm Springs, in Riverside County, and this technicality constituted Rudy's violation of the terms of his interlocutory divorce decree. But until Rudy and Natasha Valentino crawled into bed on their wedding night, no one had ever been questioned or prosecuted on this point. So when the newlyweds arrived in Palm Springs, the detectives followed them to their accommodations on the old Palm Springs Hotel property. And it was from the lobby of the nearby Desert Inn that the two detectives filed their report with District Attorney Thomas Woolwine. Woolwine believed he had enough evidence to charge Rudy with a violation of the terms of his interlocutory divorce decree. This would be the first time a case built upon the technicality of the location of the consummation of the marriage would be tested in any California court. It wasn't the DA Woolwine was eager to set a legal precedent. He was just an increasingly desperate man with motivations of a more personal and nefarious nature. On the same day as Rudolph Valentino's Mexican wedding, a commission convened in Los Angeles to investigate allegations that District Attorney Woolwine had sexually harassed and illegally fired an employee, Ida Wright Jones. To complicate matters, DA Woolwine was up for election that year, and he needed to hatch some plan to divert the public's attention away from the grim headlines being printed in his honor. Learning through his studio's snitches that Rudolph Valentino was planning to marry in Mexicali, DA Woolwine armed two detectives with cameras and dispatched the two men to follow the wedding party. He hoped to light up the front pages of every newspaper in Los Angeles with some flashy headlines as evidence he was hard at work upholding the law and defending public morality. He also knew the public couldn't read enough news about Rudolph Valentino, and reports of his bedroom activities with his beautiful bride would be eaten up by his fans. While the public was devouring every titillating detail, DA Woolwine surmised that the reports of the commission investigating the charges against him would come and go before anyone realized it had ever happened. About the same time Woolwine received detectives Wynn and King's telephone call from Palm Springs, the Valentinos were saddling up a couple of horses to head into the canyons for a morning ride. Miles from the bright lights of Tinseltown, Rudy and Natasha were taking to the hills in their chaps and 10-gallon hats, and happy to be far from the rabid attention of Rudy's growing legions of fans. During the 6 months since the Sheik's opening in Hollywood, the temptation for Rudy's fans to press in on him was seldom repressed, and he was under constant pursuit. Rudy's sightings had women fainting into heaps on sidewalks and hotel carpets, grasping hysterically at his clothing and yanking clumps of hair from his head. On his honeymoon in Palm Springs, he would be safe from harm's way while he and his new bride rode their horses along the dry creek beds to head up through the hidden canyons high in the San Jacinto Mountains. Whenever Rudy and Natasha visited Palm Springs, they stayed at the old Palm Springs Hotel, which was owned by two sisters, Florilla and Cornelia White. The sisters rented their rooms and bungalows, furnished but without meals, to handle the overflow from the Desert Inn. Florilla White was a beloved resident of Palm Springs and a doctor of homeopathic medicine. The philanthropic doctor held great affection for Rudy and Natasha and awarded them both with honorary memberships in her Desert Riders Club. As full members, the honeymooners had their choice of any of the club's finest horses. On Wednesday, May 17th, Rudy and Natasha returned from their ride in the high country to learn that attorney W.I. Gilbert had just called. He left a message with Dr. White, saying that Rudy should phone him immediately. Sensing urgency in his lawyer's message, Rudy quickly had him on the line. Within the first minute of their conversation, any hope for an idyllic honeymoon evaporated into the hot desert air. Rudy's face paled, and he turned to his wife. "We have to return to Los Angeles tonight. They're threatening to charge me with bigamy." Natasha listened quietly while Rudy finished his conversation with Gilbert. Confused and stung by the development, on this occasion they did exactly as the attorney ordered and packed their bags. Around 7 in the evening they pulled out onto the highway to drive across the desert towards Los Angeles. In the privacy of the car, Natasha made no attempt to hold back her emotions. She was distraught, sobbing, and unable to fathom why they had been singled out when so many others had done the same thing. Rudy consoled her as best he could and fought to keep his attention on the dark highway stretching on before him. By 9 o'clock they spotted the lights of Los Angeles. The dismal ride home had exhausted both of them, and even an enthusiastic reception from their German shepherds barely lifted their flagging spirits. They'd begun that day in their desert hideaway, as newlyweds with only weeks of honeymoon in their thoughts. They fell into bed that night, dreading what the next 24 hours might bring. The next day was an unnerving one for Rudy and Natasha. They spent the afternoon in Attorney Gilbert's office being duly informed of Rudy's precarious legal situation and learning the details of the possible charges against him. Gilbert explained how Rudy would plead not guilty to felonious bigamy. He then revealed the penal code, fixing the punishment for the crime as a fine not to exceed $5,000 and imprisonment not to exceed 10 years in a state penitentiary. He told them he'd spoken with Rudy's employer, Famous Players Lasky's attorneys, and they were all in agreement on one point. Natasha's immediate departure from Los Angeles was imperative. Gilbert emphasized that, for the time being, she could not be far enough away, even suggesting she might seize the opportunity to travel to Europe until the entire bigamy issue was resolved. Natasha debated the attorney at length and insisted she had no intention of leaving her work in Hollywood and abandoning her husband when he needed her most. Gilbert countered that Natasha's own reputation was at risk if she did not leave at once. Unable to dispute the logic of his argument, Rudy nodded in agreement. Natasha then resigned herself to her inevitable departure by insisting it would only be a brief retreat. At this point, Gilbert informed the pair that Jessie Lasky had already made her travel arrangements, and a ticket would be waiting for her at the Pomona train station that evening. They rushed home from Gilbert's office with barely enough time for Natasha to pack and drive to Pomona for her hurried departure. The conductor on that Thursday evening run of the eastbound Union Pacific hollered out his "all aboard" to a few stragglers and punched a final ticket or two before the train could begin its slow roll out of the Pomona station. A peanut vendor chucked the goobers in his roaster and busied himself with his brown paper bags, while two teenage girls, gawking blankly at nothing in particular, slumped out of the train's open windows. At that moment, the usual evening scene became extraordinary when Natasha dashed onto the station platform and rushed towards the train. She carried a cardboard hat box, and in her arms she clutched a Pekingese puppy. No sooner did she reach the train steps than Rudy appeared with a ticket in hand. The girls lolling out the train windows sprang to life and began waving their arms and shouting, "Oh, it's Rudolph! Oh, it's Rudolph! Ain't he grand?" When the object of their chorus ignored their racket, they struck up the familiar chant, "Rudy, Rudy, Rudy." He handed the conductor the ticket just as the train began to roll. Natasha paused for a moment on the car's narrow steps, and Rudy jogged along for a few feet to lean in and give her a quick peck. The Union Pacific picked up speed and headed east, leaving Rudy staring down the tracks at the flailing arms of his braying teenage fans. Aboard that eastbound train, Natasha quickly realized what Jesse Lasky thought of her. Despite the publicity surrounding her marriage to Rudy, he'd arranged for only coach passage, and before the Eastern Union Pacific left Pomona, she'd been squarely recognized by passengers and the railroad's crew. Sizing up her situation, she launched a futile search for seclusion, away from prying eyes, rude remarks, and after the train's first stop, aggressive reporters. Mapping out all possibilities, she found a dismal few. Meanwhile, Rudy returned to W.I. Gilbert's office, where he listened to more of his attorney's explanations of how a deal with the DA could be struck in order to have all of the charges dropped. Gilbert told his client he would take the case all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary, and explained how the charges could be considered unconstitutional because a state had no authority to prosecute an offense committed outside its jurisdiction, in this case in a foreign country. Rudy nodded dutifully to Gilbert's words, but his thoughts were drifting off to that eastbound Union Pacific. As it turned out, he had reason to be worried. At every stop, Natasha was hounded by the press, who seized the opportunity to write long, inaccurate articles about her. It seemed false news reports about the sheik's enigmatic lover made for great copy. But the more Natasha was pressed for information, the more she dug in her heels and refused to respond to the reporters' questions. They ignored her defensive silence, and at each stop across the country, she was hounded by hordes of inquisitive reporters shouting in her direction. On Saturday, May 20th, the eastbound Union slowed into the Chicago rail yard, and Natasha dreaded the predictable impasse of reporters at the station. Unable to bear another onslaught, she took refuge in a baggage car and hoped to make her escape from the train unnoticed. When a conductor discovered her perched on a large sack of mail, he tried to convince her to make her move. "Come on, miss. You've got to change trains." Just as Natasha feared, her path was blocked by yet another wall of reporters shouting in her direction. As she lowered her head and wedged her way through the crowd, she heard one reporter call out, "Have you heard they threw Rudolph in jail today?" She ignored the question, and with tears welling in her eyes, she dashed towards the station. Another reporter shouted, "Will you stick by him, Natasha? Do you still love him?" With this, she turned around, looked at the reporter straight in the eye, and gave him a single word of response: "Forever." The L.A. County Jail was no comfortable place to spend a Sunday afternoon. The slab benches and broken toilets were a long contrast to the aesthetic beauty of Rudy's home in Whitley Heights. Absolutely no attorney on earth could have calmed such a rage as his that day, and even W.I. Gilbert thought it wise to keep a neat distance from the steel bars of Rudy's cell. Gilbert explained to his furious client that his bail was being paid at that very moment by his friends June Mathis and Doug Gerard. But Rudy had been awake all night and let loose with an angry outburst in Italian. He did not care who heard him or if anyone could understand his tirade of invectives. When he paused momentarily to drag on his cigarette, Gilbert broke in. "As soon as your bail is processed, you'll be out of here, Rudy. Think about your statement to the press. They're waiting outside and are loaded for bear." Only 24 hours earlier, upon the advice of famous players Lasky's attorneys, Rudy had surrendered to the district attorney. As soon as he stepped foot in D.A. Woolwain's office, He was arrested and charged with 2 counts of bigamy. He was then handcuffed and escorted to the county jail, where his bail was set at $10,000. With every bank in Los Angeles closed on Saturday afternoon, he resigned himself to waiting for the arrival of famous players Lasky's emissary to post his bail. After a few hours, it was evident no envoy from his employers would arrive in time to spring him. Doug Gerard and June Mathis began calling in a few favors in a frantic effort to raise their friend's bail. Jerry telephoned his friend Dan O'Brien, the San Francisco chief of police, who he knew was visiting in Los Angeles. Although Chief O'Brien was unable to raise the money, the actor Thomas Mahan, who happened to be with O'Brien at the time of the call, overheard the conversation. Without asking the identity of the actor in trouble, Mahan offered to help post his bond. None of these transactions happened in time to prevent Rudy from spending the night suffering in the company of a motley crowd of petty thieves and vagrants. When Rudy's fans read news of his arrest that weekend, they not only stood by their screen idol, but subjected District Attorney Woolwine to considerable pressure. No matter where he went, he was bombarded with questions concerning his plans to prosecute Rudolph Valentino. The public demanded to know why he would charge one person with a crime and not indict others who had blatantly done the same thing. They reminded Woolwine that in October of 1921, the actress Dagmar Godowski received her interlocutory divorce decree and promptly departed for Mexico to marry screen actor Frank Mayo. Why, they asked, were no charges being brought against her? Woolwine explained that Rudolph Valentino's case was of an international nature, and because there had been no legal precedents, he would wait until the courts decided the outcome to decide whether he would charge others. It sounded like double talk to Rudy's fans, the Hollywood press, and to Rudy's lawyer. Newspapers gave so much play to Rudy's marital plight that many couples poised to make the easy drive to Mexico thought better of their scheme. After reading the reports of D.A. Woolwine's charges against Valentino, those lovebirds already on their way south hit the brakes, turned their cars around, and headed home. On Sunday morning, newspapers announced the news with sensational headlines such as "Valentino arrested on bigamy," "Investigation of Valentino wedding opens," and "Inquiry begun by Woolwine." But by Sunday afternoon, Rudy's bail was posted, and as he walked out of the Los Angeles County Jail with June Mathis and W.I. Gilbert, he made no attempt to dodge the waiting press. He paused to give them his statement as to why he married Natasha. Quote, "I, of course, regret deeply that I should have done anything that would lower me in the estimation of the American people, who have been so kind to me and have accepted me at every turn for more than I conceive to be my real worth, and who have graciously called me the lover of the screen. I will say that the love that made me do what I have done was prompted by the noblest intention that a man could have. I loved deeply, but in loving I may have erred." End quote. The press shouted more questions his way, but he nodded graciously and said he had no further statement. He was headed home to prepare a defense for his preliminary hearing, which was scheduled for June 1st. Newspapers across the country carried his statement in its entirety, and whether the public was sympathetic or not to his predicament, it made front-page news. The Los Angeles Times carried a composite photograph of Natasha, Gene Ecker, and Rudy with a headline, "Now he's wondering which one is his wife." There was no uncertainty in Rudy's mind. He would defend his Mexican marriage in court, let the truth be known, and soon reunite with Natasha. The district attorney's charges of bigamy only added to Rudy's already stressful situation. His arrest came shortly after 3 shaky months on the set of his latest film, Blood and Sand. When Rudy signed his new contract with famous players Lasky months earlier, he'd envisioned a successful working relationship with the studio. But by May of 1922, any cordial relations between Rudy and his bosses Jesse Lasky and Adolf Zucker had ceased. Lasky and Zucker's refusal to post Rudy's bail was the culmination of months of ugly dispute, which had Rudy inching towards a breaking point. It was on the previous January 17th that Rudy signed his new contract, obligating him to complete 6 movies with famous players Lasky and their newly acquired distributing company, Paramount. After first filming Beyond the Rocks with Gloria Swanson, Rudy began work in Blood and Sand. Being cast in the lead role in this production turned out to be a mixed blessing for Rudy. Initially, he was thrilled to be cast as another Vicente Blasco Ibanez character, and threw himself into his character of the bullfighter Juan Gallardo. He researched all aspects of life in the ring, grew stiletto sideburns, and at his own expense hired a matador as his personal advisor. Both Rudy and Natasha were committed to ensuring that the quality of Blood and Sand meet the same high standards of the finest art films being produced in Europe. With this in mind, they submitted a long list of requests to Jesse Lasky. They asked that George Fitzmaurice, the French-born director of romantic dramas, be hired and demanded Blood and Sand be filmed on location in Spain. Lasky's prompt and brusque dismissal of all their requests rankled both Rudy and Natasha. He informed them that in an effort to curb production costs, Blood and Sand would be filmed on a studio backlot and on his own ranch, with footage of any bullfighting scenes being shot in Spain and spliced into the final release. He also rejected Rudy's choice of George Fitzmaurice as director by stating that Fred Niblo, fresh from his successes with the Douglas Fairbanks films, The Three Musketeers and The Mark of Zorro, had already been hired. Rudy fumed and felt he had been set in his place in no uncertain terms. He refused to accept the studio's policy that all actors, no matter how valuable, were merely expected to show up for work, follow the director's orders, and keep quiet. Tensions ran high before the production on Blood and Sand ever got underway. Each contentious exchange between Rudy, Lasky, and Zucker chipped away at their deteriorating relationship. The daily flare-ups plaguing the set of Blood and Sand were trivial matters compared to Rudy's reaction after viewing the final cut of the movie. When Lasky edited out a critical segment of the plot line, this set off another firefight between artist and producer. Rudy lobbied and protested, but the campaign to have the footage reinserted into the film failed. By the time Blood and Sand was being ready for release, Rudy was completely frustrated. He reminded Lasky how he had verbally guaranteed him artistic input in his films. He argued that despite being the star of Blood and Sand, he carried no more weight in the production of his films than a $5 a day extra. His words of protest fell on deaf ears. By mid-May, the publicity campaign for Blood and Sand was in high gear, and famous players Lasky was submitting reams of copy about the film and its star to fan magazines and news services. This glut of news about Rudolph Valentino only intensified his detractors, and the timing of his Mexican nuptials could scarcely have been clumsier. By the time Rudy married on May 13th, District Attorney Wilwine wasn't the only person taking direct aim at Rudy. Just as he was preparing for his marriage in Mexicali, conservative religious and social organizations were once again accusing him of being a threat to the values they held dear. They blamed his influence on a wide range of social problems and were convinced his movies and their children's unhealthy obsession with the chic were turning all youth into lazy, sex-obsessed vagrants. Famous players Lasky deemed additional publicity necessary and issued more slick, sanitized articles about Rudy to appease his detractors. In Hollywood during May of 1922, the air was so thick with conservative moral indignation, most motion picture industry executives were choking on it. Some townsfolk worked themselves into a real lather, and no matter how flowery the studio prose about Blood and Sand's star, the mere mention of Rudolph Valentino's name added fuel to the torches in the heady campaign to clean up Hollywood. Only a few months earlier, several high-profile scandals had rocked the motion picture industry. The manslaughter trial of Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, the murder of director William Desmond Taylor, and the drug-related death of actor Wallace Reed. In an effort to protect their box office revenues and present a positive image of the movie industry, studio executives formed the Motion Picture Producers and Directors Association, the MPPDA, and appointed Will H. Hayes, a prudish Presbyterian elder and former U.S. Postmaster General, to head the association. They hoped Will Hayes' squeaky clean, high-profile presence would create an impression that the motion picture industry was putting movie stars, such as the controversial Rudolph Valentino, on notice. While Will Hayes was enjoying his first days on the beat as the movie industry's czar and being scuttled about Hollywood for photo op sessions with studio moguls, Rudy was being released from the county jail and facing a hearing on bigamy charges. If Will Hayes believed the headlines in the Los Angeles papers, it appeared that District Attorney Woolwine was just as eager as he was to clean up moral decay in Hollywood. It also appeared matinee idol Rudolph Valentino was about to make a fine example of what could happen to any movie star participating in immoral behavior. The buzz in Los Angeles focused upon one key point. Would Jesse Lasky allow Rudolph Valentino to trade in his chic spurnous for pinstripes and a ball and chain and actually serve time in a California state penitentiary? The press did their best to explain the legal ramifications of Rudy's situation and sought out prominent divorce court judges to provide legal explanations of the finer points of an interlocutory decree of divorce. Meanwhile, the man at the center of the brouhaha retreated to his home on Wedgwood Place to deal with the most disturbing aspect of the charges against him, his separation from Natasha. He was miserable without her. Rudy and Natasha were not typical newlyweds of their day who married to set up housekeeping and spend their life together after a proper honeymoon. Even though Rudy continued to maintain his residence for appearance's sake as Paul Ivanhoe's apartment on Fairfield Avenue, he and Natasha had already been living together for months as husband and wife. They shared in the daily routine of their Whitley Heights home, and their enforced estrangement left Rudy to face the burden of managing his life and the household alone. When they moved into their Wedgwood Place love nest at Christmas time in 1921, the house was more than a decade old and in need of repair. With the exterior stucco starting to crack, they'd initiated extensive structural renovations, and within a few months, 2 full-time workers were conducting the restoration. The cost of these renovations made little impression on either Rudy or Natasha, as they spent well beyond his healthy paychecks and charged many purchases, including their contractor's services, on credit. Rudy spent a king's ransom equipping a garage with the latest in automotive tools and hired a valet, a cook, and a stable groomsman to care for their menagerie. For a little while, Rudy and Natasha's bright future in the motion picture industry had been enough inspiration for them to dispose of their income with the fiscal abandon of crowned heads of state. By the time they began planning their Mexican marriage, the rooms that were barren the previous Christmas Eve were furnished with a burgeoning collection of antiques and artifacts. Natasha purchased tapestries, draperies, and period furniture, while Rudy indulged himself in antique armor and weaponry. But like a scene from one of his melodramatic movies, the enjoyment of their happy home came to a screeching halt with his arrest on charges of bigamy. In a matter of a few days, a bereft Rudy found himself rattling about the house, sinking into a fine melancholy, while Natasha was being transported from her elegant Hollywood home to the woods of upstate New York. At the same time Rudy was delivering his statement to the press upon his release from the L.A. County Jail, the eastbound Union Pacific with Natasha on board arrived in New York City. In anticipation of her arrival, her stepfather, Uncle Dickie, and Mother Muzzy closed their suite in the Biltmore Hotel and prepared to whisk her away to their chateau on the French Riviera. But when they laid eyes on the exhausted Natasha, they found her in such a fragile emotional state they postponed any trip abroad. They sent word instead to Foxlair, their country estate in the Adirondacks, saying they were on their way with their daughter to spend some time in the wooded retreat. They hoped some mountain air and guaranteed privacy would mend Natashas' broken heart. Uncle Dickie Hudnut created his estate Foxslayer over a 20-year period, ensuring that the 1,200-acre Shangri-La was well hidden high in a secluded valley in the Adirondack Mountains. With the nearest town a few miles away, Natasha would be sheltered from the notoriety surrounding her husband's arrest and her controversial Mexican marriage. Despite being tucked away, Natasha was inconsolable over her marriage interruptus, and the wilds of upstate New York could not have felt further away from Rudy if she had been parked on the dark side of the moon. She was devastated by his impending trial and his possible conviction on the charge of bigamy, which might result in 10 years in prison and the end of his career. Unable to waver from her state of high apprehension, Natasha feared the worst. On June 1st, tittering onlookers packed the courtroom as Rudolph Valentino's preliminary hearing on the charges of bigamy convened. Despite the confusing legal technicalities, his fans grasped the most important element of the case. His freedom depended upon the exact location of his wedding night. This provocative image was sufficient motivation for a mob of reporters and assorted flappers to converge upon the courthouse. The privileged few who arrived early enough to secure a seat in the courtroom kept their eyes glued on the courtroom's swinging double doors and suffered through their wait for Rudy's arrival. When he finally strode in, accompanied by his attorney, the audible wave of suspiration in his honor did nothing to lighten his disheartened shuffle to his seat. He slumped back in his chair, oblivious to the fracas in the back of the courtroom as one overwrought flapper yelling, "Rudy, Rudy, Rudy," was removed by a security guard. The judge demanded more order in the court as he began hearing the evidence. District Attorney Wilwine's case hinged upon his ability to prove that Valentinos consummated their marriage within the geographical boundaries of California. In this effort, he ordered elaborate floor plans of the Valentinos' bedroom at Dr. White's to be drawn up, and requested 2 pairs of pajamas, allegedly worn by the honeymooning couple, be tagged for submission as evidence. He then called his parade of witnesses to verify the precise location where sex had in fact taken place between the sheik and his wife. While the flappers snickered at every tantalizing detail, their sheik was barely tolerating the macabre scene and was visibly stressed. He sat in somber silence, looking like the cornered animal he was. In order to avoid a stint in a state penitentiary, it was imperative Rudy's attorney prove he never slept with Natasha on their wedding night in Palm Springs. It hadn't been that long since Rudy appeared at another Los Angeles courtroom to hear his first wife, Jean Acker, testify her marriage to him had never been consummated. Nevertheless, Attorney Gilbert took a deep breath and presented his lamentable line of defense by stating that his client, Rudolph Valentino, the great lover of the silver screen, had not yet consummated his second marriage. No matter how it appeared to his public, Rudy's only concern was that he avoid those 10 years of hard time. Attorney Gilbert summoned the Valentinos' entire wedding party to testify on Rudy's behalf. Both Alla Nazimova and Paul Ivanov took the witness stand, but as neither were U.S. citizens, they both risked deportation if their testimony were proven to be false. As they would intimate long after the fact, it just happened to be. They testified Natasha was ill on her wedding night, and as a result of her condition, the newlyweds were unable to sleep together. Ivanov testified Rudy slept on the porch that night, and said a neighbor of Dr. White's had walked by to witness the fact. The neighbor he referred to was summoned to the witness stand by Rudy's defense. He was an elderly Cahuilla Indian who wandered by Dr. Florilla White's late on the Valentinos' wedding night. He delivered his testimony by saying he spoke with a man who was sleeping on the porch. It would be the Cahuilla Indian's moment of mistaken identity that would clinch the case for Rudy. The critical testimony, as admitted into court records, read that Valentino spent his wedding night sleeping alone on the porch. Unknown to the Coahuila Indian, it was not Rudolph Valentino, but his best man Doug Girard, who slept on the porch. At the time of the Coahuila Indian's brief conversation with Doug Girard, Rudy was sound asleep with Natasha. On June 5th, the judge dismissed the charges of bigamy against Rudolph Valentino on grounds of insufficient evidence. Rudy's elation at having escaped a lengthy prison stay was tempered by the realization that his marriage to Natasha was declared null and void, and he and his bride were ordered by the court to maintain separate residences for the remainder of the year. A few days after the charges were dismissed, Jesse Lasky released his own statement to the press. He assured the public that District Attorney Wowine could still convene a grand jury and reopen Valentino's bigamy case. He made it clear Famous Players Lasky was committed to ensuring Valentino and Natasha Rambova maintained separate domiciles for the entire year. This public hand-slapping did not please Rudy. If Jesse Lasky thought this pronouncement would improve working relations with his top box office star, he was woefully in error. Further aggravating the situation, Lasky ordered studio detectives to tail the couple and report back to him if Rudy and Natasha were ever caught in bed together or in any other incriminating situation. It was obvious to Rudy his employers could keep him in line by threatening to pass along any of the detectives' revelations to the district attorney. Knowing he held no cards, Rudy bowed, at least for a little while, to the studio's authority. By mid-June, Rudy was completing work on his next film, The Young Raja, and had worked himself into a black-hearted mood. He argued, brooded, and exhibited a very thin skin. Without Natasha, he was unmanageable, and made little attempt to hide the fact. As filming on The Young Raja wrapped, Jesse Lasky presented his indignant star with another legal document to sign. This paper stated that by affixing his signature, he would effectively waive any artistic input in all phases of the production of his future movies with Famous Players Lasky. Rudy was incensed, refused to sign, and flipped the document back at Lasky. Making matters worse, Lasky proceeded to inform Rudy that all of the studio's legal fees incurred from his bigamy hearing would be deducted from his future paychecks. Reaching his boiling point, Rudy hurried through his scenes in The Young Raja and headed home to Whitley Heights. He took solace in the company of his friends, Paul Ivanhoe, Doug Jerry Girard, Robert Flory, Mario Carrillo, and the French actor Jean de Lemure. They rallied to distract Rudy from his stressful situation by ferrying him around Los Angeles for dinners and clubbing, including trips to the Ocean Park Pier and the speakeasy, The Plantation, in Culver City. But Rudy's heart was seldom along for the ride. And most evenings he opted to stay at home and compose long love letters to Natasha. The logistics of running his household that summer became increasingly the concern of his valet, cook, and groomsmen, who stood helplessly by and watched while the young master of the house nursed his depression with rash expenditures. As Rudy incurred exorbitant phone bills and telegram charges and instigated more costly renovations on his home, the household staff was not always sure there would be enough money to cover their weekly paychecks. The summer wore on, and Rudy spent most of his time at home with his dogs, writing poetry and puttering around his garage. He took fencing lessons, and to the distress of his friends, began refusing their invitations. At some point, he also began contemplating a decision to break his contract with Famous Players Lasky. He vowed never again to allow any employer to assume such control over his life. The more he agonized over his situation, the easier a solution became. He would simply run away. During his final days in the Whitley Heights home that summer, Rosa Rosanova, the actress who played the role of his mother in Blood and Sand, came to Rudy's aid as a mother confessor. Rosa, who was then 53 years old, took the despondent Rudy under her maternal wing. She was fond of him, and he called her Madre. It broke Rosa's heart to hear co-workers on the set of Blood and Sand referring to Rudy behind his back as, quote, that wop dishwasher. So Rosa made a point of checking in on her friend, and some evenings she would stop by the Italian grocery store and arrive at Wedgwood Place with all the ingredients for his favorite dinner, spaghetti. While Rudy tended to the pot of boiling spaghetti, he bent her sympathetic ear. And whenever Rosa found an opportunity to do so, she tried to persuade him to pay more attention to his household finances and to the stacks of unopened mail littering the house. "Rudy," she asked, knowing his answer to her question, "are you happy?" "How shall I answer you?" he sighed. "I am happy, but my heart is heavy with regret. I am a success, but beyond there is something that I dare never speak of, Rosa. I cannot work for Mr. Lasky another day, and I am leaving Los Angeles very soon. I am going to New York for the opening of Blood and Sand, and I will then go to see Natasha at Foxlair." "Rudy," Rosa replied, "you have no choice but to stay here. You have a contract, and the court has forbidden you to stay with Natasha." Rudy was adamant. "Nothing you say will change my mind." It was clear to Rosa that Rudy had already made his decision. "How will you leave New York City without being discovered by Lasky's detectives, your fans, the press?" she asked. Rudy smiled and fixed his gaze on some sure and distant scenario. Travestimento, Rosa, in disguise. Thanks for listening, and my next installment will be Chapter 7, titled About Face. I hope you will subscribe to this podcast so you will be notified when the next chapter goes online. As always, you may find your copy of Affairs Valentino on Amazon and all online book-selling venues.